So we're going to discuss Rudy Wiebe's Where is the Voice Coming From? It's a short story, Canadian short story, and it's a complicated text in terms of its language, but let's try and sort of break it down. All right. So to just give a brief summary of Weeb's story, uh, the story comes to us from this very intellectual lens, and it seems to be a factual record of an incident where there is a gun standoff between white Canadian police officers and Native Canadians of the Cree tribe. And this is regarding the capture of a Cree fugitive called Almighty Voice. Now, there is a museum dedicated to the incident, and we're given various facts, before the narrator persona stitches it all together as a narrative. So now it seems pretty straightforward when you look at it in that fashion, except is it? It really isn't. So what we actually realize when we look at this text is that it's a fascinating text that lends itself to a great deal of post-colonial critique. Right? Because there are a lot of facts that emerge as you start breaking it down that make you realize that the entire text is kind of suspect. So let's go back to the beginning of the text and start to sort of break it down and see how the text has been constructed to underscore the problems of narrativizing that the colonizer or a person from a colonial space of power undertakes, which usually ends up suppressing native or indigenous voices. So now, the opening line of the story is very interesting. So it's the problem is to make the story. And there are a couple of intellectual quotes about the historian's work or the researcher's work. So it seems like, okay, this is about how the historian puts all the facts together and then weaves it as a narrative to give it this comprehensive whole. And of course, some facts will be hard to fit together, but you will sort of learn to give it some kind of construction or some kind of framework that makes it sort of legibly and intelligibly sort of come together. All right, but you realize as you read the story, when you finish it in their first reading of it, that it is more about how the colonizer constructs the story without doing due research of the colonized perspective. So it then becomes a commentary on how the people who hold power decide how the narrative should come across. Right? And in that sense, it just classically goes back to the idea of history itself. In fact, a lot of people will tell you how history can be reread as his story, which itself is a statement about power, because it goes back to the very basic power structure that exists in our society, which is gender. All right? And how masculinity can sort of decide so many things, which comes to play here as well. So Weeb makes all these interesting statements, and they kind of foreshadow the issues of the story. Like the opening itself forces us to ask some pertinent questions, like how are we making the story? What is our lens? Are we being fair? Are we neutral? Are we merely intellectualizing? Or are we biased? And these are important questions because when you start the story, you do read it from a certain perspective because you're not questioning the narrator, right? Because the narrator comes across as completely competent because he's male, white, intellectual, seemingly fair. So you're like, yeah, totally. Till you suddenly realize, can I necessarily buy into what this narrator is telling me? Right? So those are some of the questions the text really throws up for us. Now, he goes on to make this really interesting statement. An affair 75 years old should acquire some of the shiny transparency of an old man's skin. It should. So it's like he makes a statement and then he questions it like, should, but is it? Is it really coming so? Because you realize that by the end of the story, nothing's actually clear. And that lack of clarity is the only clarity you receive from the entire narrative. So you realize that you're given a lot of facts, a lot of details. So it's almost like, like there is an information dump that happens. You're given people's names and, how they're connected to each other. All of those things come to you. All right. But there are issues in that as well, because the narrator, especially when he's describing native Canadian characters and he describes their names, he mocks it. He's kind of calling it out as, oh, that's so strange. Oh, of all the things, like, how could you be named this? And that's a really interesting statement, because it is quite a reference to how the white colonials approached native names and native identities, because they approached it as strange, and then they chose to sort of translate it into their language, which made it even more awkward. Right? And so automatically it loses the context that it originally comes from, and it becomes this mere imitation, which sounds completely insensible to the white colonial. It becomes another way for them to sort of marginalize them, criticize them, and place them as irrelevant. And the other thing they do is that wherever possible, the white colonials prefer to use a European name for the native person. So, for instance, in the case of Almighty Voice, the fugitive, who has been, there's a bounty placed on him of $500. And so in the awards proclamation, instead of referring to him as Almighty Voice, which is his name, he's referred to as Jean-Baptiste, because that's his French name. And that's a European name, so that's an acceptable name, as opposed to, oh, this name that makes no sense to us. So because his Cree name, in translation, is of no value to the white colonial. Now, as the story progresses, we realize that the narrator is describing different items in different glass cases, right? Because he's, after all, in a museum, and so he comes to talk about a bone from a skull, which is presumed to be Almighty Voice. Then he goes on to describe the guns used during the standoff, and the differences get quite stuck actually, because the gun used by the white Canadian officers has been polished and cleaned, and he actually devotes some time mocking that by giving us this really tongue-in-cheek description of the cleaning process. In contrast, however, the guns used by the Cree warriors is poorly maintained. All right. Now, he tries to intellectualize the reasons for it, but actually it just reveals this attitude that anything that's owned or used by the Cree has no relevance to the white colonial, and so they have scant respect for that. Now, my favorite statement actually comes when he describes a building that's been preserved in the museum. So it has been meticulously cleaned and painted, and he says, the logs inside have been smeared again and again with whitewash, perhaps paint, to an insistent point of identity-defying characterlessness. It is such an accurate representation of what has happened to the knowledge or historical record of this incident, and on a larger scale about the whitewashing of Native Canadian identity and experience to this day, because how much of it is actually represented in the way it ought to be, in the way it ought to actually be defined and understood. And I think a good digression at this point would be to talk about the Canadian series Anne with an E. Now, that's a really interesting adaptation of Anne of the Green Gables, but the point of my digression has to do with the third and final season of Anne with an E, where we are introduced to this Native Canadian girl, Kakwet, and how she's sent to a Canadian school for Native children, which is a reference to the Canadian Indian residential school system. Now, the Indian residential school system in Canada aimed at isolating the children, cutting away their access to their indigenous identity, as well as forcefully assimilating them into white Canadian culture. Now, this compares with the experience that we find about the Australian Aboriginal community as well. So, they too had their children forcibly taken away from them and sent to white settlement schools. Now, this generation in Australia is known as the stolen generation. All right. And there have been, of course, apologies, formal attempts at reconciliation, and a lot of things to sort of right the wrongs, right? But that by no means means that this incident is solely in the past, because this is still a part of people's present. For one, when you call it post-traumatic, stress disorder, the fact is that for many people, they're still recovering or living through those effects, because a lot of people who went through those experiences are still alive. So it's not post-traumatic. It's currently ongoing as far as they're concerned. And their children are the ones who are also dealing with the backlash of this. On the other hand, there's also the fear that continues to reside in a lot of people. So for instance, like I said, in Canada, there is a lot of reconciliation attempts happening, but there are enough narratives about how Australian Aboriginal mothers continue to live in fear that their children will be taken away from them. Now, is this real or imagined fear are two entirely different things, but the point is that even if the law says something, how much of it actually pans out in practice is a whole different thing, because when a community has already been marginalized, they become vulnerable to more acts of violence. And in fact, like I said, even now, if you look at, say, in the context of Denmark, in Denmark, Inuit women have their children forcibly placed in foster care because they are seen as incapable of giving their children the right education to assimilate into Danish society. All right. And so they are marked out as being, incapable of raising their children. They are, a lot of times they are claimed as being not intelligent enough or not having a high enough IQ to raise their children. And also because their culture has different expectations from what Danish culture expects. So they're seen as, no, your culture is bad. We need them to have Danish culture, so we need to take them away from you. So that is still happening. So it's not isolated in the past. It's all part of a larger problem that once you sort of decided that, a community or a people are irrelevant or incapable, that can translate into taking away their autonomy over so many different things. Their children, their body, their land, their wealth. All right. And in fact, another text that can be viewed in this context can be the 2023 film Killers of the Flower Moon, which looks at the murders in the Osage community. Murders undertaken by the whites who lived amongst themselves, many of whom married into their families. And this is known as the Reign of Terror among the Osage. And so this is an ongoing problem. It's just conveniently sidelined because it's not something that people necessarily acknowledge in their current space. Because, when you've already marginalized a community, you can push them to the sidelines. And so then what happens in the sidelines does not matter to the rest of the people, because it's not their problem anyways. And it's also very easy to be like, oh, but it happened back then. Like, I don't think it happens now. Like, come on, you're just, And so it's easy to sort of discredit such a narrative. Anywho, to return to Rudy Wiebe's Where is the Voice Coming From? The narrator, he does something very interesting when he starts to sort of talk about the place where the incident took place. And so he talks about how the place doesn't exist. And I mean, especially on the map, because that name is not relevant anymore. But the actual geographic place obviously still exists because it's part of the landscape. And so when you read that, you're just like, that's a strange kind of aside for you to have. But it's again an interesting comment for us to read into, because land is looked at very differently from the colonizer's perspective and the colonized perspective, or at least in the place of the colonizer usually looks at land in terms of what can be gained, what can be taken from it, how prominently does it work as a landmark, all right? But for the indigenous population, land can have spiritual significance, cultural significance, emotional significance, and they do have a tendency to imbue it with some meaning, which automatically changes the narrative for them. So it's not viewed in the same lens as how the white colonizer usually looks at land. All right. Now, we are given a lot of details right throughout the story, but one of the things, and there's a reason to keep coming back to it, is how every time female characters are discussed in the story, they're discussed as not having a voice, not being relevant, not being acknowledged. They're kind of like this faint presence, blurred in the background. And that's really interesting because we already can tell that the men are misrepresented in the story, the native, the Cree men in the story. So in that case, the women are doubly marginalized because they don't actually have any kind of significance in the story. And that's kind of this very problematic aspect that comes through for us over here. And especially the idea that we're talking about how they don't have a voice, they don't speak. In fact, there's another really interesting statement where he's talking about this one native Cree woman. He says that there is what can only be called a quizzical expression on her crumpled face. It may be she does not understand what is happening, and that she would have asked a question, perhaps of her husband, perhaps of the photographers, perhaps even of anyone, anywhere in the world, if such questioning were possible for an Indian lady. It's kind of like, her having an opinion, nice, interesting idea. Why? So, the irony of the fact that the story is called Where is the Voice Coming From, and the fact that the women characters don't have a voice, is brilliant. So we will pause here and we will continue with our analysis.